Stacy, Kelly, want to make sure you guys can hear us and can talk back, so if you can let us know if your mics and everything are working.
Everything works. Hi, everyone.
Easy.
I can hear you, Courtney.
United Way, don't go from the whole thing, or is it that would like it to?
Hi, Sarah. Everything working okay on your end?
Yeah, seem to be. Hi there. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome.
Great. I think we're good to go ahead and get started then. Welcome everyone to our whatever meeting this is. We are thank you. Our September 10th meeting of the Early Learning Advisory Committee, which we are happy to call to order here at 1:02. We'll start as we always do with review and approval, we hope, of the agenda. So today we have a really important meeting. I know that we have all been really looking forward to around our early learning workers and the compensation that professionals in this area are perhaps not receiving, but the sort of art of the possible if they were to receive it. So we're anxious to give some time to our subcommittee for a report out. But before we do that, we're going to hear from a group that's been doing a little bit of research on background about why it is that people choose to come into this field and what makes them stay. So we thought that might be good context as we turn it over to the compensation study folks. And then lastly, we're going to spend some time on an update around the rule promulgation that I know is of much interest to both folks listening at home and to those participating here around the room with me. And so we're going to get a little bit of an update about what we might expect from this point forward in terms of rolling out the rule promulgation process. So do I have a vote to approve that agenda? So moved. And a second? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, any opposed? Okay, before I move forward, I want to say a couple of thank yous and welcomes as well. So we have new faces around the table and a few old friends that are spending their day somewhere else, although they're with us in spirit, we hope. I want to thank both Betsy Delgado from Goodwill and Aaron Donovan from Ivy Tech, who have served admirably throughout their terms, and we've really appreciated their voices over the last few years. We are adding to our ranks, though, not to be forgotten, Sam Sneidman, who is the VP of Government Relations for United Way of Central Indiana. Welcome, Sam. Glad to have you here, as well as Dr. Stacy Atkinson, who is the Chancellor of Ivy Tech Indianapolis, who I believe joins us remotely. So welcome, Dr. Atkinson, as well. We don't want to say you're setting the standard, Stacy, but I'm told that you also helped to make sure we had lunch here in Fort Wayne. And so
I did, and I hope it was yummy.
It was, and we'll apply that pressure to Sam for next time. Just kidding. For anyone listening at home, I'm just kidding.
You're up, Sam. You're next.
Our catering services don't go quite as far as Ivy Tech.
More importantly, I also just want to thank the Fort Wayne Community Schools. So we have had an amazing day in Fort Wayne today, and Kimberly Brooks has helped make sure that we had a bus driver back there somewhere, and the opportunity to tour a number of both community-based and school-based providers across Fort Wayne. And you know, as a committee, I know we always gain so much from the experience to be in different settings of care and to understand sort of what the lived experience is in those places. And so thank you for giving us an opportunity to learn today and to sharing some presentations while we had lunch as well. So with that, I think if I give Courtney enough time to walk back here, she's whistling across the room. We are ready to move forward into the meat of today's discussion, starting with, as I said, a report that we hope will set the context for sort of the journey of a childcare worker or early learning professional in Indiana today. And so Child Trends has been doing some work on behalf of the organization that I work for, Early Learning Indiana. And I believe Sarah is on to share with us some of what they found to set the background for what we are going to hear next in terms of compensation.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for welcoming me today. Yes, my name is Sarah Amadon. I am from Child Trends, and I'm representing work conducted by myself and some of my colleagues here, Elizabeth Reddington and Katie Pascal, and a much broader team as well that we'll get to as well. But what you're going to hear from me today is a study we did over this past summer, really trying to examine and dig into and understand the journeys and pathways of ECE educators in Indiana, and to understand a little bit better some of the reasons that they are attracted to stay in and ultimately might leave the field. So we're going to talk about those things today. So we can go to the next slide. So Child Trends is a nonprofit organization. We promote the well-being of children and conduct applied research to inform public policies to achieve these ends. We partnered with the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment, and also we collaborated with Early Learning Indiana on this work, who've been great thought partners and collaborators throughout this whole process. Next slide. Great. So we're going to start with a brief introduction and highlights from the study that we conducted this past summer, which was really fast and furious, and we were really happy with both the survey and focus group respondents that you'll see here in a moment. Next slide. So we worked with Early Learning Indiana to recruit ECE educators in Indiana via, and we recruited them via email. They were largely connected to Early Learning Indiana initially, and were invited to complete a brief survey of about 12 to 15 minutes. Then these survey respondents were also invited to participate in focus groups, and it could indicate their interest at the end of the survey. So as a result of this recruitment process, we got responses from over 500 total survey respondents, which is great. 273 of those were administrators, which were largely program directors, also could have been assistant directors or curriculum coordinators, things like that. 117 were center educators, which could have been teachers or assistant teachers. 133 of those were ministry educators or administrators as well. And then 132 were from family childcare homes, which could have been the teachers or directors of those homes or serve in other staff roles. For the focus groups, we went into much more depth on early career pathways and did this great journey mapping. And we actually received some follow-ups with some wonderful graphic designs of their pathways in ECE, which we'll be eager to share with Early Learning Indiana. We had 22 participants, which included 7 administrators and 15 educators. Really wanted to note briefly that this sample is not representative. You'll see that they were largely had been in the field for longer. They were calling and career motivated, which you will also see, and had a greater intention to stay than we would anticipate for some other educators. Please note briefly, just you might hear me use the term home-based and FCC interchangeably, just because they that's how kind of our organization uses that. So tried to switch over to FCC homes, but you might see that as well. So next slide. And this is just an orienting slide, as we thought about this attraction and retention and pathways through the field, we think it's important to highlight these different levers of change. So when we think about supports for ECE providers and ensuring they're attracted to the field and want to stay, these are some of the ways we can think about supporting and the levers of change to encourage that support. So system level includes things like elements set up by federal, state, local governments, things like local funding or regulations that can set the conditions for how childcare operates. Program level supports then include things like compensation and benefits, which of course are set in place from some of the system level supports like funding. leadership characteristics of administrators and other directors, and then the overall climate of the program. And then individual levels that can support staff include things like the psychological and financial well-being, which of course can be influenced by the system and the program. And it also can include things like education, training, and professional development. So we're not going to talk a ton about these for the rest of the presentation, but this is just something to keep in mind as if we think about those levers to help recruit and retain staff. Next slide. Great. So we're going to now return to some select survey and focus group results. These are not the full findings. And we focus first on attraction to and pathways through the field. Next slide. So we wanted to first start by acknowledging that recruitment in ECE is really challenging right now. It's probably nothing that's surprising to anyone on this Zoom or listening in today. We found that recruiting qualified applicants into ECE programs can be challenging, and only about half of home or center-based administrators reported that they had a qualified applicant for a position that had been open recently. And in some cases, as you'll see, it was just one applicant that was actually qualified for that position. And this is in the context of potential recruitment tools like educator boards or things like that. So that's just to set the stage. However, we see that there's a lot of motivation and journeys through the field, which is on our next slide. So we asked educators both in the survey and in focus groups to really talk about their journey through early childhood education. What brought them in and what paths did they take? And we see that the main motivations to enter the slide are these religious or personal callings related to supporting the community, to supporting families, and to supporting children. Many also describe that it's a real journey, often in and out of the field or the program, that often takes them back into the field, right? And many cited a high commitment to the field, which may not be surprising given that many of these educators had 5 or more years of experience, and that there could be really different entry points into the field as well. So there's no one set path for early childhood educators in Indiana. We also have to note that burnout was an issue. You can't deny that working with children can be physical and both, and emotionally draining work. And burnout can be driven by a lot of factors. And so thinking back to those levers of change, there's a lot of potential ways to support educators. Some of these factors can include unreliable leadership, unreliable scheduling, a lack of administrative support, few or narrow opportunities for professional growth or development, and just a lack of resources within the program itself. Some cited actually having to use funds to purchase supplies themselves. If we go to the next slide, we see a little bit more from our survey results, the motivation for working in childcare, and then the job prior to childcare. We break these down here by respondents. So we see administrators in the navy blue, educators, which could include teachers and assistant teachers in kind of the royal blue, and then our home-based or FCC in the baby blue there. So really we see kind of across respondent types, there was similar inclination in terms of saying that it was a planned career or a personal calling. For FCC educators in particular, almost over 20% said they wanted to work in the field because they could do it while they had young children at home. And then smaller proportion said it was a way to help children. If we turn to like a job prior to childcare, again, thinking about the last slide in the journeys, we see that for a lot, almost a quarter, right, a little bit depending on respondent type, that working with young children was actually the first job. However, we also saw that retail was a common job prior to childcare. And then we have this large other bucket, which I realize is not super satisfying. However, we really just see, going back to the last slide, that there were a lot of different journeys and prior roles before entering childcare. We can go to the next slide. So we're going to turn now to look a little bit at preparation for the field. Great. And so this is a mix of our survey and focus group findings. Obviously, preparation is really key to effectively working with children and supporting ongoing professional growth for educators. And we see that almost all educators had taken a PD course in the past year, likely because of Indiana's requirements, but many also cited additional needs or desires for professional development, especially wanting training to prepare to be a director at some point, not necessarily, next week. Also to prepare them to work with children experiencing trauma or those with challenging behaviors. So there was kind of a gap there that educators cited that they really desired to help support them be better educators. We also heard quite a bit in survey or focus groups that teach scholarships were very important to really help prepare them for working with children in these programs and as avenues for growth and development. Although they also mentioned that it could tie them into a particular center because of the different requirements of the scholarship. Next slide. Great. So retention is obviously critical. We have these educators, a lot of them in this story very were motivated. What were some of the mechanisms that they mentioned that could help retain them in the field? And we start first with thinking about benefits. I realize you have this large compensation study, so we wanted to present more today on some of the benefits the educator reported as important. So we break this down by respondent type with administrators in blue, center-based in purple, and home-based this time, or FCC, in orange. What shouldn't be surprising is that this was the benefits offered to the staff who were reporting out here. And we see that obviously there was no one benefit type that was offered to all educators. That was not the case. The most common benefit offered was paid time off for vacation, and the next one being sick time. Health insurance also was offered with some regularity, but only to about 50% of the respondents. And when I say 50% of the respondents, obviously I'm only talking about those working in a center-based or ministry setting. That's excluding the home-based, which, as you see, that the majority of the home-based respondents, over 50%, said that they were offered no benefits for working at those centers. I realize this is a lot to take in. I apologize, it's a little fast. But if we go to the next slide, I'm sure these will be shared, that the benefits were really important to all who were offered those benefits. So these were those among respondents who said they were offered the benefits. And this breaks down by how important they rated those benefits, and we collapsed important or very important. The other response options were not at all important or somewhat important. So we really see that the benefits were very important to all the staff who were offered them. Among FCC providers in particular, those benefits that provided flexibility, like free or partial tuition and flexible scheduling, were especially important. But we also have to remember that many of the other benefits just weren't offered to FCC staff. So this is not a large number of respondents here that we're talking about. And then for the student loan repayment and summers off, that was less important in general, and it also was not offered to the FCC staff. Next slide. Great. So through our focus groups, we also sought to understand what could lead educators to leave the field, or even if it was temporarily. And they largely kind of mirror or reflect what we heard for retaining or attracting staff, which meant that really leadership was very important. So those program level levers, that a lack of organization or a lack of administrative support and program leadership was a real challenge for staff and could prompt them to leave. In addition, we see that limited mentorship or limited professional development opportunities that kind of really were meaningful for the role, not kind of things like health and wellness, hand washing, diapering, things like that, but really kind of meaningful professional development to support children was also could be lacking and could prompt, a educator to leave the field. In addition, a lack of access to resources and needing to spend individual funds could also be a real challenge for educators and be an impetus to leave positions. And again, this theme of burnout, in For these respondents, it was could be juggling multiple roles within the program, so having to wear too many hats rather than really just focusing on their role could really be a challenge and prompt people to leave. And then also, sorry, going back briefly to leadership, for some instances in larger or chains or corporations in particular, that administrators with limited experience in working with children, limited like on the ground experience in the classroom, really could be a challenge and be a disconnect between leadership expectations and program staff. Great. Just have a couple more slides here. Awesome. Okay, thank you. We really wanted to end on this note, which we found encouraging, potentially reflecting the maturity of the educators who responded to the surveys and focus groups. But we wanted to mention that we asked educators about their 1-year and 3-year intention to stay in the field or stay in the program. And these are the 3-year retention results here. So there's some really important trends here to mention. First, we do see a high degree of stated intention to stay, especially among administrators and home-based providers, where almost 2/3 indicate that they intend to work in the same program in the next 3 years. But even teachers and assistant teachers similarly report an intention to stay. Second, for administrators, lead teachers, and home-based, a solid proportion, about 15%, reported a desire to move to another ECE career that was not in direct care. So indicating that there was some motivation, but potentially in the next 3 years, it would be a challenge to stay in that classroom setting. And about 1 in 4 assistant teachers reported some limited attention to stay down there at the bottom in the light blue, with plans to leave within 3 years. That could indicate, a lot of different things. Assistant teachers or aides also did talk about in focus groups that it was kind of much more physical labor. They were doing a lot more of the cleaning and the diapering and things that they didn't necessarily expect going into that role. So it could reflect some of those issues there. But importantly, we really did see that among these committed educators who had this, a lot of them stated this personal calling or passion to stay, that there still was a large degree of commitment despite, some of the other challenges that we noted as well. So those are the findings that we'll present today. We have a much larger report that we are sharing with Early Learning Indiana, and I believe will be made publicly as well. So we're happy to answer any questions today, and then we'll of course be making the full report and the full set of findings publicly available in the next month or two. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share this work today.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a really helpful overview to get our heads in the right place and thinking about who we're talking about here today. Anybody have questions for Sarah?
Yes, ma'am, I do. Mark.
Yes,
Here.
Mark, please.
Sarah, do you guys do this work in other industries, or is it all education, or just tell me about where the background of the work comes from?
Sure. Yeah, Mark, we primarily do this work with early childhood educators. Child Trends has a group of staff that also work in education, but I primarily work with ECE educators. We also do some work with other direct service providers as well.
Okay, what I'm leading to is,
yeah.
The question is like my youngest daughter is an 8th grade math teacher, and like this is our conversations at night. It was all these points that what attracted her to the profession, what things might make her leave. And so I'm just wondering if there were any huge red flags that were waved for you that said that this is a fact that makes early learning different from other professions where a lot of the same lack of leadership, lack of benefits, there's some commonality among. It's not just unique to ECE, right? And so I'm just wondering if something's really stuck out to you that's unique to this area.
Yeah, great question. No, yeah, definitely, I agree with you, Mark. There is a lot that we heard here that is common to other industries, especially those that do direct service work, like teachers, social workers, things like that. I think some of the things that stood out to me were the kind of level of passion and commitment that you hear, which really contrasts to kind of the benefits offered and received, and then the compensation received, I think you do see this kind of disconnect between what that passion, that compensation, right? So, which isn't surprising necessarily in other fields either. I was surprised, I will say, by that commitment, frankly, to the field and to working with children, kind of in spite of these challenges. And I also think that it's important to note, I was a little bit surprised, which also, maybe it isn't surprising kind of when you think about it, but when educators talked about how leaders that had experience in the field, how important that was to really feeling like they were supported themselves. So I think thinking about some of those pathways to administrators and educators via actual classroom work, how important that can be as well. So just off the top of my head, those are a few of the things that come to mind. But yeah, happy to think through that more as well, and you'll see a lot more in the full report too.
That was a great question, Mark, and I appreciate the insights there. I just Googled, and it looks like no one won the Mega Millions yet. So if Sarah, and this may be a completely unfair question, I'm going to ask it anyway, because you've been in the data, and I'm just curious for your perspective. So understanding that we are about to have a whole conversation around compensation, if you win the Mega Millions tonight, and of course you want to dedicate it all to the early learning workforce in Indiana, because who wouldn't? I wonder if you had to make a bet, sort of based on what you've seen outside of the compensation conversation, where would you invest the dollars that you have available to address the underlying causes that you've surfaced through your research?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I would almost split it up, and I'm going to make this up, right? But I would say a third, compensation, meaning wages, the next third going to benefits, and then the final third going to professional supports for staff and directors. It's like a three-legged stool, right? If you take one out, it's going to fall over, and we've been teetering on this two-legged stool for a long time, So I think we saw that a lot of these educators, the compensation story is not new. It's one that you guys are going to talk more about. We know it's a problem across the country. I think what's also very important, what we hear less about, is just benefits. And both benefits professionalize and make educators feel like they're valued in other ways. But it's so important also to that thread about the importance of leadership and support and professional development. I just think you can't also support that professionalization of the workforce without that other bucket going to support the professionalization, the professional development at all levels of the organization.
Got it. Well, we'll all be cheering that you win. Then.
Okay, great.
Great. Any other questions for Sarah? Thank you so much, Sarah. We really appreciate your spending time with us this afternoon. It's a great introduction to our topic. So
absolutely. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Feel free, my email's on there. If anyone has any questions, they're welcome to follow up.
Fantastic. Thanks. And yeah, Early Learning Indiana will certainly make the full report available to anyone who has an interest. So I appreciate that as well. Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you, if you don't mind, to give an introduction to the work of the subcommittee. You've been very busy since last we met, and so if you want to kick us off and welcome our friends from Talent First in 1833.
Okay. First of all, I want to say thanks to everybody who spent a grueling 2 days in Indianapolis. We had a lot of fun together. We played with Legos, and it was a part of a team building and visioning exercise. And, it was enjoyable and I think insightful in that we sort of, when working with your hands, this is the way it was presented by the facilitator, things, your mind becomes more active with ideas. And it was incredible how many ideas came about. And then the rigorous yet respectful conversation that went on between the members of the committee and the back and forth, and the amount of knowledge in the room was just amazing. And, we asked out of the box questions, we proposed crazy things, but that's the way innovation happens. And I think with Alex and Adam's leadership as facilitators, I think we can look at this document that we're about to review and be proud of the work so far, and be confident that that's something that we can put forth that would bring forth some meaningful changes legislatively or otherwise. But I just want to say thanks for everybody that participated, and I'll let the experts take over from there, Alex and Adam.
Great. Well, feel free to chime in as they go, Mark, and we appreciate your leadership.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, well, great introduction, Mark. And I just want to echo this sentiment. It was great to spend time with the subcommittee, really working through some of the finer details of recommendations, and really getting a lot of input on the actual report. So I want to say that we do have a full 50-page draft prepared right now, kind of working through some of the revisions, incorporating some feedback from some committee members. So I want to say that we do have a lot of information, way too much to share today. So I will try to stick to kind of the key findings. And I'll let my colleague Adam talk specifically about some of the recommendations and what we're proposing to do to address the compensation issue. Yeah,
Alex, I would be remiss if I didn't mention to Maureen that our group, one of the products of our time together was a new acronym, and I didn't think there could be any more, but we actually created a new acronym. If Alex or I don't want to explain that.
Yeah, Mark, in my opening remarks, I actually was really struggling because I was trying not to use it because I know we hadn't introduced it yet. So anyway, I appreciate adding that level of complexity to our work. Thank you for that.
Yeah, great call out, Mark. So I cannot take any credit for this new acronym, but essentially we're referring to it as EASL. So thinking a bit more broadly about ECE and acknowledging that there is a lot of valuable programming that's happening out of school time, that the ECE acronym doesn't fully encompass or really do justice to. So you'll see that we're using this EASL acronym kind of throughout the report and throughout the presentation today, just to kind of acknowledge the inclusion of the out of school time programs. All right, Courtney, you can go to the next slide. And so when we think about kind of where we started, we had 4 guiding questions. So one was really looking at how early educator or ESOL pay compare against jobs that require similar skills and credentials. So really benchmarking wages at a competency level, really as opposed to just looking strictly at wages according to education experience. Second is really looking at how wages compare across Indiana's workforce development regions. So some interesting findings there that I'll talk about in just a second. Third was really looking at the role that quality rating and auspice play in determining compensation. So talk a bit more about that. I think some surprising things that we found related to that that I'll talk about in a second. And then finally, this whole question around what do we actually do to create a more sustainable ecosystem. So Adam's going to talk about basically the exercise that we did during that 2-day workshop and the series of recommendations that we formed kind of based on the findings that I'm going to share in just a second. All right, so when we look at how early education wages compare against similar roles, Courtney, you can go to the next slide. So we see that the median wages of Indiana's early and school-age learning workforce does reside in the bottom 10th percentile of all occupations in the state. So we have sort of the lowest earning entry-level role, aides or floaters, earning about $13.90 an hour. That ranks in about the 4th percentile, which is actually behind occupations like motor vehicle operators and food service workers that are earning about $15 respectively. And then we see the highest earning ESOL occupation, lead teachers, coming in at about the 10th percentile with a median wage of $16.28. So I think that's interesting. Essentially, another way to put that would be that 9 in 10 occupations in Indiana earn more than a lead teacher. So when we look directly at the comparison of lead teachers to kindergarten teachers, recognizing that there is a high degree of overlap in the competencies and credentials that are required for the two roles. You'll see that there's almost a $10 difference in the median wages between those two roles. So kindergarten teachers currently make about $24.48 per hour at the median. That ranks in at the 52nd percentile. So quite a significant difference between kindergarten teachers and lead teachers, just sort of reinforcing some of the points that were made earlier about benefits. Want to reiterate that early learning careers don't necessarily have access to the same types of benefits that we find in the K-12 setting. So this is strictly looking at wages, but want to acknowledge that the benefits is a whole other can of worms that widens these existing gaps. Second thing I want to point out on this slide here revolves around the administrative positions. So we look at childcare administrators or center directors. You'll see the current median wage is about $23.16. So that ranks in quite a bit higher than the teaching roles, 45th percentile. But when you compare that to what an administrator could make in the K-12 setting, you'll see that is almost double at about $46.77. So that is currently at the 90th percentile. So only about 1 in 10 occupations in Indiana currently make more than a K-12 administrator. When we look at how that relates to self-sufficiency, we see that about 8 in 10 ESOL workers currently earn below the self-sufficiency standard for a single adult in Indiana. So what we heard from the committee is that a lot of ESOL workers are actually parents themselves. So this is strictly looking at the self-sufficiency for a single adult. The self-sufficiency for an adult with 2 children would be almost double that, about $44.16. So we still have a sizable portion of the workforce that is not capable of being self-sufficient in supporting themselves, let alone their children. So if you compare that to the current percentage of K-12 teachers, Courtney, if you want to hit the next animation there, you'll see that about 1% of kindergarten teachers are earning below the self-sufficiency standard. So what I want to reiterate here is that there is a high cost associated with low pay, not only in the robust workforce that is required and what that means for the economy, but also in the amount of money that is required to essentially support these folks through public assistance programs. So we'll provide some numbers on what that looks like in a second, but just want to reiterate, there is a large portion of ESOL workers who are currently not able to support themselves with their current wages. All right, so when we look at how the lead teacher role compares against similar occupations in Indiana, you can see that there are 5 roles here that are most similar. So we have bank tellers, self-enrichment teachers, office clerks, psychiatric aides, and kindergarten teachers. All of those share at least 93% of skills. I guess 92% for office clerks. If you look at kindergarten teachers specifically, you'll see there's a 94% overlap in the competencies that are required of the 2 jobs. The full report goes into more detail regarding what those skills specifically are. But you'll see that across the board, lead teachers are making quite a bit less than these comparable roles. So essentially, any of these comparable positions represents an opportunity for a lead teacher to enter an alternative career without really any upskilling or reskilling, because again, the education qualifications are similar, specifically for the teaching occupations. When it comes to self-enrichment teachers, office clerks, bank tellers, those jobs don't even require a college degree. So the typical education required to enter those roles is just a high school diploma. So you'll see that most lead teachers would be almost overqualified for those positions. In the green there, you're seeing the share of lead teachers who would be earning below the median wage for each of those roles. So currently we have about 98% of lead teachers in Indiana earning less than the median wage for kindergarten teachers, whereas about 68% are earning less than the median for bank tellers, which is the lowest earning comparable role. And then you can click ahead. So if we look at inflation, Sorry, the formatting got a little crazy on these. I will share some updated slides after this. But lead teachers, so the wage growth for lead teachers is exceeding inflation, whereas you see wage growth adjusted for inflation for kindergarten teachers is actually not keeping pace with inflation. But what I want to say here is that regardless of the inflation numbers, you'll see that kindergarten teachers in 2005 were still earning slightly more than lead teachers are earning today. So even though the wage for kindergarten teachers has not kept pace with inflation, you'd still see a lot of kindergarten teachers earning more in 2005 than lead teachers are earning today. All right, Courtney, you can click through. And so again, when we look across the workforce development regions, there are quite distinct differences in terms of educator pay. So if you want to click ahead, Courtney. So we see that region 10, which is down at the bottom, kind of southeast there, is actually the most competitive in terms of percentile ranking. Probably no surprise would be that region 12, Indianapolis, does have the highest median wage at $15.84, compared to all other occupations that are employed in that region, that only ranks in the 8th percentile. So I think region 10 is interesting because it shows the importance of competition. So thinking about Louisville, which is right across the border, wages are going to be quite a bit higher. So even though region 10 has the second lowest cost of living of any region in Indiana, it does have some of the highest wages for ESOL workers across the board. So this tends to be consistent both for lead teachers, assistant teachers, subs, as well as aides and floaters. So quite interesting to see the role that competition plays there. What else is interesting is that region 5, which does have one of the highest costs of livings, actually has the least competitive wages for early educators. So you can kind of see that that is ranked in the 6th percentile with a median wage of $14.37.
Hey, Alex, just a point of clarification as I'm processing here. So for this map, the colors obviously separating the regions. Is the saturation, what is it telling me?
Sorry, I think my connection got a little weak there. What was the question?
And what's the saturation of the color telling me, or is it just distinguishing the different regions?
Color is just distinguishing the different regions.
Got it. I'm up here with a bunch of folks in Northeast Indiana, and I didn't want them wondering why they were lighter than Evansville. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Just to distinguish regions not affiliated with value or ranking or anything like that.
Got it.
All right, so when we look at how wages compare against provider type or auspice and quality level, we find quite interesting findings here. Again, formatting on these is a little bit crazy, so I apologize for that. But we do find that there is a difference in median wages by provider type. So consistently, we are seeing center-based programs and public school programs offering higher median wages, whereas home-based programs are trailing quite significantly. So do want to flag that this is based on the market rate survey. So response rate was only about 20%. So you'll see the full-time equivalent numbers that those figures represent. So again, not necessarily representative of the entire system, but some interesting takeaways nonetheless. And if you want to go to the next slide. So I think what's interesting here is when we look at the distribution of wages across provider types, you'll see that there is a lot more consistency or uniformity associated with school-based settings. So Courtney, if you want to click through, there's a little animation there. So you can see that those distributions tend to be a bit more uniform. There really aren't any crazy outliers that are pulling the numbers up or down. But when you look at center-based programs or even family childcare programs, you will see that the distributions are quite a bit less uniform. So it just kind of reinforces the, I think, role that unions might be playing. And we know that there are very robust wage scales associated with school-based settings. So I think that is what we're seeing here, where we're not necessarily seeing that standardization or uniformity across different provider types that we are seeing with these school-based providers. All right, and so then when we look at PTQ level, we really don't see a significant difference in wages based on quality rating. I think the most important thing here would be, I think that accreditation might play a significant role. So you see between level 4 and level 0, there's about an 11% difference or $1 difference in the median wages of EASL workers. So I think that, again, is related to accreditation because there are some pretty strict requirements around education in order to maintain your accreditation status. So aside from that, we really don't see a significant correlation between quality and wages, but we do see something interesting when it comes to costs or the essentially share of operating expenses that are attributed to payroll, which are on the next slide. So when we look at the share of expenses that are attributed to employee compensation and benefits, we do see that there is a weak correlation between quality and expenses. So obviously that is probably driven by size. So recognizing that fixed costs like mortgage and utilities are going to scale down as your size increases. So as you're employing more workers, you're serving more children, the fixed costs are going to be a smaller percentage of your overall operating budget. But what I do want to point out here is the large share of expenses that are currently going to staff. So there really is not a lot of wiggle room in the cost model right now to increase wages without a direct cost for parents. So as of now, overall, providers in Indiana are spending about $2 in every $3 each year on employee compensation and benefits. So benefits could include things like unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, or additional benefits like healthcare, vision, retirement, things that were discussed by Sarah. And so what I want to get to now is more of the kind of cost modeling and understanding what the impact of increasing educator pay might be on the state's budget. So you want to go to the next slide, Courtney? So if we brought all current EASL workers to that self-sufficiency standard, first of all, we would
Hey,
see—
Alex.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but for those of you in the meeting or online, this is probably the most impactful thing that we can present to the people that we want to affect change. And just so please understand these next couple slides.
Thanks, Mark. So based on what happened in Quebec, which did a pre-K for all type model, universal pre-K, they actually saw the employment rate of mothers increase quite dramatically. So for married mothers, that increased by 7.7% over 8 years. For unmarried mothers, that increased by 4.4%. So if Indiana were to see the same gains just for mothers, about 6,000 to 11,600 Hoosier mothers would rejoin the workforce. If all of those women earned the statewide median wage, which is currently $24.19, and averaged 35 hours per week, which is what they saw in Quebec, the income, the combined new income associated with those women alone would be somewhere between 642 million to 510 million. Now, based on your current state income tax rate of 3.15%, that would translate to a gain of about 8.3 to 16.1 million just from new women re-entering the workforce because they now have access to quality, affordable childcare. Now, if we increase the earnings of ESL workers accordingly, so again, bringing all of them up to that self-sufficiency standard of about $20 There are currently 39,000 workers who are somewhere below that threshold. So increasing all of those up to that threshold is somewhere around 590 million. But in order to provide care for all of those new mothers, you would also increase current capacity. So that would translate to about 2,610 more workers, obviously depending on the number of children, the age of the children, but that is sort of the average number that we would see. So if all of those folks were earning the same distribution that we're currently seeing, their combined earnings would be about 10 million. So all in, you're seeing the combined income of the current and the projected early childhood workforce increasing by about 619.7 million. So again, looking at the income tax rate, that would be about 19.5 million in income tax revenue associated just with the ESOL workforce. So if you want to go to the next slide, I've got it broken down so it's a bit more clear. So next factor in this equation relies on public assistance funding. So again, we have 81% of our current early educator workforce earning below the self-sufficiency standard, which means they are heavily reliant on public assistance programs. So it's very hard to determine what the actual cost would be because we don't know the exact number of children each of those workers have and what their household dynamics look like. But current spending based on family type could be a low end of about 4,632 just for one adult below the self-sufficiency standard to a high of about 43,572 for one adult with 2 children. So again, that is based on the current median wage for the field. If we brought all of those up to that self-sufficiency wage of 2044, the potential spending would reduce to about $156 a year for one adult, or $26,208 for one adult and 2 children. So if we look at the delta or the difference, you'll see that the savings from self-sufficiency alone are somewhere between 49 million and 815.6 million. And if we take what we know about the current makeup of the ESOL workforce, based on some workforce studies that I've seen, specifically from the Association of the Education of Young Children, it's estimated that that cost would be somewhere around 662.2 million, acknowledging that about 80% or over 80% of early educators do have at least 1 children under 18. All right, so I think this is probably the most compelling number here is the fact that it makes sense and it's a revenue positive number over a set number of years. So I've seen a lot of studies about this that say that over 8 years, the cost of high quality childcare are net positive for society. And it takes about, I think, 16 years or 10 years for the cost to the government to be fiscally positive. So just want to acknowledge that there is going to be essentially some startup cost in the interim until we're able to see those women rejoin the workforce. But all in, we're looking at a net positive of about 78.1 million. So again, we're seeing gains both from new mothers rejoining the workforce, from ECE workers themselves now earning higher wages, paying more income taxes, as well as the fact that they're no longer as reliant on public assistance. So all in, the benefit would be about 697.7 million, whereas the cost to bring everybody up to that minimum self-sufficiency standard would be about 619.7 million. And I know Mark requested some breakdowns looking at the projections, which are on this slide here. So essentially what we're looking at is the cumulative cost, cumulative savings, and the net associated with raising the minimum wage for the early educator workforce to each of these wages on this x-axis. So you still see everything in the positive until about 2119. After that point, folks are no longer seeing as much savings from public assistance because obviously there are income thresholds on that. So we're not necessarily seeing the savings continue after that point. But essentially, you would see net positives given our current assumptions until about $21.19. So again, that is assuming that we see the same results as they saw in Quebec. That's assuming all of those women are earning the statewide median wage. That's assuming that about 80% of them are on public assistance and kind of maximizing the benefits that they're eligible for. So there definitely are a lot of assumptions that we're making here. So I think that's why we came in at a relatively more conservative estimate of the self-sufficiency standard, leaving a little bit of wiggle room for some of those assumptions. But again, this is just kind of looking at what might happen if we did raise the kind of wage floor to each of these wages.
The subtlety of that, Alex, just to add to it, is that if you get up to that, what is it, 2119? If you get up to that point, you actually open yourself up to a whole nother portion of the available labor force, which then just kind of you'd have to go back and change the numbers again because you'd have more people involved. You'd have better retention. People would stay where they are longer and so forth. So there's a lot of subtleties around that. Is just other than just raw wages.
Yep. And I should also add the sales taxes as well and just economic activity. So that is an additional benefit that we would see from more financial stability, is the fact that people would essentially have more income to be spending more. The other factor here is around male workforce participation. There's really not any good studies out there that show what might happen to fathers and the workforce participation of men. So that is kind of a big caveat here in that we're just looking at women and not necessarily the additional benefits that would come from that. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Adam to talk more about the recommendations.
Let me just pause you right there and just make sure that we don't have questions from the committee before we.
Sure, yeah.
Any questions around the data? Have you done that same analysis in other states? And I guess how have those states used it, if so?
We have not. This is the first.
Well, way to break ground here. Thanks for that. It's really powerful information. All right, let's continue on with the recommendations then.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Alex, for that wonderful intro. And I think Mark talked earlier today about our session a little over a week ago with the subcommittee, which was extraordinarily helpful at modifying some of the recommendations and creating them to align with some of the great work that Indiana is doing already. But at the end of the day, we started that session and ended that session with the same conclusion, and that is that we have ultimately, if we're going to rely on the mathematics that Alex identified, we have to increase access, and so that was our goal. Our thought going in, our goal coming out. So I'm going to start, I deleted a couple of slides that showed the amazing Lego pieces that were created by the subcommittee, but we do have some pictures to share. But I do want to just start out by talking about the current state. These are words that are directly out of the subcommittee members' mouths. Disconnected, lack of agreement, chaos, but a strong foundation, some progress and momentum that Indiana's made over the last several years around the ECE system, but also concern about losing that momentum. Lots of barriers that exist all over. There are a lot of people that want to help, but not a lot of alignment. Lack of focus, very strong concern about the potential to go backward. and just a lack of organization in general. There were a lot of other words as well. These were the ones that were most common throughout the Lego building session. And as Mark indicated, we asked folks to use their hands to build. Go ahead and burn through those animations here on the future state. And these are the ones that were used to describe a desired future state. Because ultimately, if we can't look at where we're at today and set a vision for where we want to go, we're never going to get there. And we're never going to successfully employ strategies. So child-centered was the one that came up more often than any of the other ones. Strong foundation, statewide ecosystem that harbors and lifts up regional flavors, lots of ladders of opportunity, passion, but not to the point made by your previous the previous presenters, not passion being the only motivation for people working in the EC workforce. Lots of science and data-driven decision making, and a system that is accessible for everyone. And so I think these are really, really amazing visions to describe what Indiana should have. And I give a lot of kudos to the subcommittee members. It was very exciting. It was fun couple of days, but it was an exciting couple of days too that culminated in them working on some road mapping on how to bring recommendations to life to really transform Indiana's EASL system. So why don't we get into the initial policy recommendations? So when we looked at this exercise, we always try and look to transforming systems by systems level thinking. And I put this visual aid up here because it is still, after report that I've read, the one that comes to mind the most. And it's an illustration from a book called Coherence by Fullen and Quinn. And it describes how to transform systems from ones that are chaotic to ones that are deliberate and make sense, and how we iterate and get there. So just as a piece of homework, I would always recommend this book. It's focused on a K-12 example in Ontario, but the reality is it's applicable to all types of systems thinking. Next slide, please. So in our subcommittee discussion, we did these 4 items. We established what our goals were going to be. We determined strategies that are necessary to meet those goals. We costed out the ways to pay for some of these strategies, looking at that long-term payment plan that is going to be dependent upon increased workforce participation. And then we talked about holding ourselves accountable. And those are really the essence of those 4 slices of the pie in Coherence. So let's get right into the recommendations. The first bucket, these are bucketed into three areas. The first is increasing access. Ultimately, if we're going to achieve greater workforce participation and create a sustainable paid for system with lots of funding, descriptors that were utilized by the subcommittee, we have to increase access. And the first place that we want to start is in an area that Indiana has already started to make great strides on. And by the way, several of these recommendations highlight the great strides that Indiana has already done. So I want to give all of you a pat on the back. There were several independent examples in states we looked at that are going to be highlighted. You all have started to take steps forward already, and you deserve a lot of credit for that. So this is in that case, this is one of those areas. So further expand the service affordability for EASL professionals. This is a culture shift. So as was highlighted already today, it is difficult to recruit for a variety of reasons folks into this profession. And we have a lot of strategies that need to be employed in concert with one another to fix that. But the greatest policy recommendation goes nowhere if the culture is counterintuitive to it. And we believe strongly that this type of culture shift is a critical component towards improving the workforce. And that is ensuring that if you are working in the workforce and the wages may not ever be as competitive as some careers, you need to make a lot of progress towards that, but you can always expect that your kids are going to be taken care of, and it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg to do so. So this is an important part. You've already started some of this. We know at some point it will likely require some additional state funding, and that will require potentially the way that you are funding things to shift and decoupling, debraiding things. So that's the first recommendation. Next slide, please. This slide has a few animations on it, so why don't you go ahead and throw them up. Thank you, Courtney. The aspect around public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships, as Mark discussed several times throughout our committee, are nothing new. We utilize these in areas of public policy from environment to K-12, and they are starting to be utilized more in the early childhood space. You have a great example in Northeast Indiana with the TriShare Plus pilot that is starting. We are not recommending that TriShare be the only type of public-private partnership, but it is a mechanism that is spreading the state's share, or allows the state's share to be spread further and potentially deeper, and allow for a potential subsidy expansion to greater numbers of families. And it's also a mechanism that is gaining popularity in other states. Michigan was the first to create a TriShare pilot. That was 4 years ago now, and North Carolina has started it as well. And so we're seeing some potential promise, but the reality is that an expansion and innovation around incorporating the private sector is going to be important towards moving some of this forward. It's also important to encouraging your policymakers to put greater emphasis on state funding of subsidy and allow for greater expansion of that subsidy to greater numbers of families. That's going to be important too. So it's sort of a shared effort, if you will, and it's the responsible thing to do. The other thing, before we go into that next element, there was a lot of discussion around public-private partnerships and how they can affect families in communities who are not employed by the employer. And there were some great ideas around allowing employers to purchase spots at local ESOL programs that were for families that were not employees, but it was a community-focused effort. And so I want to highlight the opportunity that I think that's important. There's other ways to do some public-private partnerships and fund some of these things we'll talk about later. But I think having that community-focused lens is going to be important, and the subcommittee highlighted it too. Next slide, please. So we think one of the really unique opportunities for policy innovation is through some of the microfacility pilots that Senate Enrolled Act 2 afforded. You know, these are a regulatory reform mechanism in a lot of ways, and by all measure, it appears that there's a lot of opportunity for innovation. We really suggest doing some deliberate pilots utilizing the microfacility expansion and testing out some transformational problem solving. So things like, but not limited to, providing care for families who are working non-traditional work hours, providing for direct pipeline, meaning early childhood educator training to provider pathways, and really testing out innovative compensation strategies, doing some things differently in an effort to see what will appeal to folks in a real world setting. As with anything, any sort of pilot, I think everyone here already knows that making sure that we are tracking what's going on so that we understand what decisions are being made that have impact and what are not. We're not confusing correlation with causation is going to be important. Next slide, please. The final area in this first bucket of increasing access is one that is focused around shared services. So Early Learning Indiana has already been piloting some shared service models in various regions of the state. And we really suggest that, that there is an expansion of these on a statewide basis, but it be done based on an evaluation of what's working and what's not. Shared service models are very common as an attempt to make things more efficient in the public sector. Sometimes they work and sometimes they do not, but oftentimes they don't work because we're confusing causation with correlation and not doing things deliberately and not establishing ownership for what a new service delivery model could look like, who's responsible, and creating buy-in across the field. So those are a few things you'll see in the report. There's an expansion of this recommendation that talks about those things. But great work that's, from what I understand, already starting to show some fruits by Early Learning Indiana. But we have, I think, more opportunity here to expand and create some greater efficiency, in particular with back office or non-instructional services, but even at some point leading into professional training and potential instructional services, depending on the situation. Next slide, please.
And I'll just interject that we were honored to help some local communities start their shared service pilots, but those are happening in regions all across the state led by community-based organizations in those areas. So just to clarify.
Excellent. Yes. And I think there's going to be a lot to be learned as you keep going forward. The second bucket is really focused on a strategy that is necessary in order to increase access. And that is the people. You know, as Alex highlighted, the largest portion of providers' budgets, I think you all know, is people and associated costs. And so we need more people. We need to, in order to get to that increased access, that increased workforce participation within the EASL sector and without it or outside of it, and pay for that these costs, we have to expand participation. And so the first step, of course, is being able to increase the number of people who can work in providers. You have started some of this work with some apprenticeship models already in Indiana. The Teach Scholarship Initiative is one mechanism that focuses on recruiting people who are working in the EASL sector and upskilling them. It's a great model. It's been replicated in other states as well, and Indiana's been doing it for quite some time. It is restricted to certain types of post-secondary education, though. And I think it's our thought that being creative with multiple pathways, alternative pathways in particular, to meet people and determine what the skills are that are needed and maybe the skills that are not needed, and focus on the ones that are. And so being creative with your apprenticeship efforts to get post-secondary credentialing is going to be important. I think you've got a great start with Teach in its current form, but we think you can be even more creative going forward too. The other thing that we think is going to be important is that Teach is mostly focused, I think exclusively focused on workers who are in the profession already. We think you're going to need to look far beyond that. And that's where some efforts to recruit, through a grow your own effort that we looked at in other states in the K-12 sector make a lot of sense. They're focused on getting folks who are in the community, but are not in the profession. And so we think expanding some of the way you're doing apprenticeships to recruit second career folks from within the community who are not in the profession is a good way to start. Next slide, please. The The next type of apprenticeship is focused on young people. Another positive aspect of Senate Enrolled Act 2 is this expansion to a younger age range to attract high school students into the profession. You have, again, already a tool that you've created, the CDA assessment scholarship that does require, again, working in the profession, which is aligned well with Senate Enrolled Act 2's requirements as well, and encourages those young people to participate through a CTE program while in school and work in early childhood. We think this is a great start. And really, we're not recommending necessarily a policy change here, although you could when it comes to modifying your TEACH scholarship. You could also modify this one similarly. But what we're really recommending is that there be a continuous, seamless pipeline to ensuring that young people in high school are able to take advantage of all apprenticeship and scholarship opportunities to get them to that lead teacher post-secondary credential should they want to go there. And so aggressively marketing it, making sure that these scholarship programs are working in concert with one another, and that as a potential junior in high school pursuing a career technical education track in early childhood, it's easy for you. You don't have to think about it in terms of your pursuit of the profession. And by the way, it's going to be almost entirely paid for. So those are important characteristics. These will, again, likely require some additional state funding if you are successful at recruiting folks in the profession. That's a good thing because it'll pay off in terms of those economic returns that Alex highlighted earlier. Next slide, please. The next area, and this is one that I don't know if I'd say it has some controversy, but it's one that is becoming far more popular across the United States, mostly in the K-12 sector. When we're dealing with situations where there are uncompetitive wages for certain important classifications of employees, we're seeing moves to shift towards minimum salary requirements from a regulatory basis, and also coupling those with career lattices. As I said, these are becoming more popular in the K-12 sector, and the ECE sector is quite a bit different structurally, but we think that there's a way to work towards this as a long-term goal. We think it will help create a culture of professional development within the ECE sector that will be attractive to folks, in particular if you're going to compete with K-12 educators. There's a lot of alignment there, as Alex previously highlighted. And also, we think it will be helpful to encourage public investment coupled with private investment in raising wages for these folks, especially entry-level wages. So we think this is, again, part of that culture shift. One of the things we heard during the subcommittee in particular is that linking this to PTQ makes a lot of sense, but the reality is that PTQ might need some reform. Now, we didn't get into a lot of the characteristics around what that reform is. We'll lean on the subcommittee members to highlight it more for your full committee. But there seemed to be a lot of concern with linking it to PTQ in its current form, and that PTQ as itself should be modernized potentially and improved. So we think that creating that linkage will be important to reward providers for greater quality, and also for staff with increased credentialing that's relevant to increase performance. Next slide, please. The final bucket is focused on early revenue. As Alex clearly articulated in those slides that preceded me, just preceded me, our long-term revenue plan for improving early childhood and out-of-school time wages in Indiana is focused on workforce participation. We think ultimately that is the way you are going to achieve success and sustainability and meet that future state. We know that that is not going to happen overnight. It will take a decade plus to get there. And we know that you're going to have some revenue streams in order to deal with your cost model in the shorter term. The first is around job growth incentives. And we have a few that are highlighted here to encourage employers and reward them for participating and providing early childhood education to their employees, or participating in one of those community-focused efforts, as we highlighted under the public-private partnership slide earlier. There's also a way that this can be done through expanding On My Way Pre-K and focusing on providing additional supports, additional scholarship vouchers to families who are taking advantage of that system. So there are a variety of ways to reward employers for getting involved in a public-private partnership and structuring things. We think you should take advantage of what you've got and also work towards some things that you don't have on the books. I already focused on this a little bit. We'll keep going and get into the focus on a tax credit around working parents. And I'm also going to add in, it's not on this slide, but I'm going to add in another tax credit idea that could be used to reward working parents who are in the early childhood sector. So Louisiana has a great couple of opportunities. I think Indiana started to move in this direction, but Louisiana has been for years offering 2 tax credits to working families that are EITC style tax credits, refundable, to highlight and reward families for working and contributing to their economy, and providing participating in the ECE ecosystem as well. One is focused on quality, one is focused on participation. We think enacting and expanding both of them in Indiana would be a good win. We also think that that one that is focused on working families who are in the ECE ecosphere adds to that service affordability mechanism that we talked about earlier. That could be a way to start off a compensation strategy, that career ladder, or career lattice rather, that we highlighted earlier. So that's the final earned income style tax credit, a refundable tax credit that we want to highlight. And then the final thing is, we didn't get into this, we highlighted just at the end of our subcommittee discussions, the importance of data transparency. Policymakers, especially ones who are likely to be from the more fiscally conservative end of the spectrum, are going to need to see exactly what's going on. From what I understand, you are already building a very inclusive dashboard to track progress. We think that is great, and utilizing that data to demonstrate wins is going to be part of your narrative that you're going to need to sell, coupled with some of that economic data, collecting that. There's one animation here, if you could hit. And I want to highlight this last point just to close things out. There are a lot of great ideas that often don't see the light of day or fail even in their implementation because of their implementation. So I put this on this slide because I want to emphasize that when you pilot something, understanding what that causation is versus what that correlation with success is or failure is going to be really important. I think everybody here knows this, certainly anyone who's in a leadership role in an organization. But I always like to describe it because it is really the secret sauce. We as policymakers, I have a former policymaker myself, often attribute success and failure, and it becomes black and white. The reality is there's a lot of gray. And so data is going to help us get there and determine what causation is for failure, what causation is for success, and likewise what correlation is. So I'll stop there and again, just thank the subcommittee. They spent a lot of time with us on Zoom before we got together in person, and a significant amount of time with us over those 2 days. It was extraordinarily helpful and has informed the work that you've heard from Alex and I on today. So thank you. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. I know there are folks who have questions around the room, and so I'll invite them now. Or online.
So I guess I'll start. Just a couple of things. If you go back to the your first your salary scale slide. If we can go back to the salary scale slide.
I think it's in the second bucket.
Sorry.
All those animations.
Yeah,
Right.
I should have made a note, and I
Right.
would be in this
There.
position. Next one.
Yeah, next one.
Next one.
Next one, yeah. Last slide in this bucket.
There it is.
There you go.
That's what I'm looking for. Awesome. So the notion of a salary scale or a salary floor, like, seems to make intuitive sense, particularly given sort of like the examples that we've seen today at like Fort Wayne, right? You mentioned that many of your teachers are on, maybe they're not on the salary scale, but they're paid in a similar contract, right?
With our other elementary teachers.
Yeah,
Correct.
right.
Yeah.
Are they part of the bargain? Are they part of
Yes.
the bargaining unit? Okay.
Yes.
So, that makes some sense in particular kinds of contexts, like centers or like providers that are in schools. I guess my question for you is really more about how you manage some of these things with family, home-based care situations, right? I see the idea of a refundable tax credit, which again, can make some sense if you also can do the administrative work to, sort of know to apply for that tax credit. Some of the challenges, I think, may not be totally resolvable, like there's gonna be some paperwork involved, there's gonna be some element of that. But I'm just wondering if in looking through the other state examples, you mentioned Louisiana, are there examples of targeted supports at home-based or family-centered care that can address the salary side of the equation in a similar way to what's being contemplated with a salary schedule?
So this is an excellent question. And I will tell you, I think that in the ECE world, this is a pretty new tip of the spear idea. Illinois has started this idea around structured salary relatively recently, and there are not too many states that have actually done this in the ECE world. I think to answer your question, I think there's always going to be some types of providers that are likely to not be able to participate. It's not going to work well. We think that as you look to reform PTQ and also deal with potential licensure reforms, this is one of the things you need to keep in mind as to aligning up who is going to be under the auspices of a compensation schedule and who, based on potential licensure or PTQ level, may not be. And we think that there very well could be an added benefit or potential reward for providers who are under a salary schedule and at a high PTQ level. But we also acknowledge that this is not going to work everywhere, and certainly in those home-based settings, family-based settings in particular, this is probably not going to work at all. That's okay. And so our thought is that as you move forward with it, that you're conscious of those differences.
Can I ask one more?
Sure.
So semi-relatedly, right? Throughout all of this we've talked about today, there hasn't been like a mention of, while there was a mention of like, how do we expand out accessibility of care for the workforce to cover 100%? Like, great, makes sense for that. we haven't talked about sort of the subsidy levels and the award amounts that we have for our existing programs and how we can leverage those in a way that supports what I would hope is the clear provider desire to pay higher salaries to be more competitive, right? So I would just encourage us to think about that in addition to these recommendations, that we're also thinking about how we use existing subsidy, how we can maximize those dollars or find new dollars to put into the system.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Sam. And, you know, part of my concern with more programmatic solutions is that they're easy to strike as administrations change and fortunes or priorities change. And so I think the more that we can focus on sort of the foundational structures that we have and getting them to a place that is more sustainable, the greater the likelihood that we'll have long-term success. So I appreciate that comment as well.
Sam, let me, this is Mark, let me address that directly too, because while I left the room very excited and satisfied by what had been done, I drove home and I felt like there's just so much more to do. And I don't know if that is, if there's a, you know, is this recommendations 1.0 and then there's a 2.0, but you know, we didn't even touch on leveraging technology or AI to, you know, it's another way to drive revenue. You know, two ways to drive it is to cut costs or to add revenue is to how you create cash. And certainly technology used in the appropriate way here could cut costs in many ways. And so there's one of the things we didn't talk about. And there's a whole plethora of things, as you alluded to, in the tax code that could be leveraged. And you know, from TIF districts to personal property deductions to tax credits, there's a whole bunch of stuff we didn't talk about. But I really think that the committee did a fantastic job, but I can't help but thinking there's a lot more to do.
I would totally agree with that.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just echoing. I think, and actually, Mark, in looking through and capturing your notes from your mapping exercise, you highlighted some of those tax code elements as well. So we're going to leave you with that document too, highlighting really what your 1.5 or 2.0 steps are.
Yeah, and I do think, you know, there's something highly dissatisfying about not having solutions that are more inclusive of licensed homes, given how important they are in Indiana and the percentage of capacity that they represent. And so I guess I would encourage the committee to continue to focus on that particular issue, recognizing that it might not happen in the same way, but still obviously needs to happen. And I guess that for me too is sort of what gets me back to how do we live within the existing structures that we have and push additional dollars through existing pipelines where appropriate as sort of the fastest way to drive change. But more work to do there. Questions from others on the committee?
It's a comment. I appreciate the detail of the work that went into this and how thorough the recommendations are. Two that stood out to me are making sure that people in the childcare profession are able to get that care for their own children. I think that's huge to try to encourage more folks in that workforce and make it possible for them to be a part of that workforce. And also struck with me the grow your own recommendation. And I've that resonated with me in the presentation we had prior to the meeting about the intentionality of which they are trying to set up systems to allow them to create more workforce through providing education for students in high school and in the early childhood pathway. And I think that is something that could be replicated in other parts of the state as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we've heard a little bit about that, but we haven't had an update lately, and that might be good to have more of an update around that someday soon. Great point.
And I guess maybe my ignorance of not understanding the entire essence of the funding streams and where all that comes from. And I certainly agree with Sam's comment. We hope everybody is on board with trying to move these wages higher. I guess my concern is how do we do that without passing costs along to the consumer, if you will, and making the cost of that care even less affordable for people. And I'm sure that's being talked about, and there are solutions being discussed on that. But that's something that just sticks in my mind is how's that going to work?
I mean, I'll tell you, for me, two things have to go hand in hand, that we have to continue to charge what it actually costs. And that probably means that we have to increase the income eligibility threshold so that a higher share is covered by the public sector. And that's worthy of much debate ongoing, but I just have been looking at this issue for a long time and don't really see how the math works otherwise. So. Although I do think some of the solutions that we've talked about and more public-private partnerships, they are a piece of the answer to that puzzle, and getting the incentives in the right place as well. So
I just like, I understand, Mark, I want to say thanks to the committee. I was sorry to miss and lose my battle with COVID avoidance, but that was actually the bigger sadness for me, I suppose. But I keep thinking about this tax code thing, right? We hide a lot of public benefits in the tax code. We hide a lot of subsidy in the tax code that I don't think people fully recognize or appreciate. But that creates some real inequities for who can access those things, right? Like, you have to know, I have this opportunity to pull down this credit. I got to apply for it. It might be more costly for me to apply for it if I use a tax preparer or things like that, right? So while it is important for us to think about things like tax credits, and it's important for us to think about tax structure changes and how to make those things more equitable and fair, we also have to think about how to make sure that administrative burden isn't keeping people from accessing. In the same way, we need to make sure administrative burden isn't keeping people from accessing the subsidies that exist for families, right? You talked about, you have a staff member whose whole job is to sort of walk people through this very complicated process. And this is not necessarily because FSSA or OE CASEL wants to have a complicated process. It's because they have requirements that they have to follow, right? Like, we have to just, I think, as we think about what our responses to this happen to be, these are good ideas, important ideas. Tax credits, especially if they're refundable, go a long way toward helping alleviate poverty and helping address the sort of cash shortfalls that people face. But we have to be really, really cognizant of not increasing the administrative burden, particularly on small centers or nonprofits or home-based providers who already have difficulty in managing some of those things without shared service opportunities and networks.
yeah, great point.
Hey, I'll tease you with one thing for that comment. I really like your ambition to go down the tax road a little bit, but I'll tease you with one idea. So here's a case where revenue already exists. We have a neighborhood nearby here where we had 3 humongous companies come in and build their new headquarters here just outside between Valparaiso and Chesterton. And so the municipalities negotiated with them a TIF district around the taxes that were generated from their development. So there's revenue that exists there, right? Well, why wouldn't a portion of TIF revenue, instead of fixing roads and bridges, which are brand new anyway, so they wouldn't be used for many years, why not direct TIF funds to subsidize childcare where these employers need it the most, which is to attract and retain talent? That's just one example, but there's lots of ideas like that that are very viable that already exist, where we don't have to create new tax codes or rewrite things. They just have to be looked at with common sense.
Other thoughts? I think it's a really rich discussion, and there's obviously more work to do, Mark, as you alluded to. Although for level 1 recommendations, I really appreciate the work of the committee and where you've gotten us. I think there is a very detailed report, as I understand it, that the committee has produced. And so I know that has not been circulated yet to the entirety of the ELAC. So my recommendations would be two things. First of all, if the committee could take a stab at going through and making sure that we have clarity about how each one of these recommendations would flow across provider or auspice types. I think that will be useful to help our understanding overall. So I'd ask for you to sort of create a grid. I know we had a lot of conversation around the salary schedule in particular and how that would be applied. I think the others generally apply across settings of care. But if you could just confirm that, because I think it'll be important to make sure that we are sort of auspice neutral in the recommendations. And then produce that final report to us here in the next handful of days. And I know you're just about there. I would propose that we then schedule a meeting. We are due to officially approve our report on the 30th of September, I think, based on the requirements of Senate Enrolled Act 2. And so I would ask this group if we might just convene very briefly. Those of you who are from out of town, will make sure that all the Indy-based folks are in the room to meet the requirements of open door, but that way we can approve the final report once we've all had a chance to look not just at the high level recommendations, but at the detailed report as well. Does that seem reasonable as a way forward?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great.
Maureen, I got a question from Maureen and or Courtney, because Courtney mentioned it at our subcommittee meeting. There was I'm confused about some of the ELAC members are voting and some are not. And so I just want to make sure we're following the rules as far as approving things and so forth. And I don't really, I'm just asking the question because I saw my name on there and then not voting, which is not a problem. I don't want to vote on things I shouldn't be voting for.
Yeah, so technically our members that are appointed by the General Assembly are technically non-voting members according to Indiana code. We have not had an incident where non-voting members have opposed something that voting members have encouraged. So we haven't run into an issue where it's been a problem yet. But looking forward at kind of solidifying our governance structure and really creating a feedback loop with our subcommittees, we're going to look at, is that serving our committee? And if it is not, how do we change that within legislative code? I think would be a very helpful thing to look at next session. Or keeping it if there was a deeper reason for why the legislature wrote that in there. So it was just it's a piece that's in our code that we were handed. So we've treated our group very much as like all equal. Everyone's opinion is on equal footing. So we haven't necessarily honored that piece of code, but technically the 4 members appointed by the General Assembly are not voting.
Yeah, and I guess I would say I would still very much like the perspectives of all of those members represented, including whether you endorse a particular proposal or not. And so, while we continue to work on the governance issues, I think if we could just continue to sort of play through, and assuming we don't have a hotly debated item that
I think
does not meet the will of the committee, in which case we will of course abide by the legislation as handed to us.
I think endorsement is a really great term to use because while our board votes on things, we don't necessarily have any authority to force issues, but we are endorsing. And so when we do vote, it's more an endorsement situation. So we're working through some of those governance structure issues and hoping to have a much more consistent feedback system with our subcommittees like we did today, where we had a subcommittee come through and report on recommendations and get to talk about it, and then we'll come back and talk about it again. So it won't be such a quick, we won't get information and be expected to make a decision on it right then. So to come. Good question, Mark.
Any last questions before we leave that? All right. Last, but certainly not least, I know we had a question, I think in the last meeting around just the rule promulgation process. I know there's been lots of energy and interest from around the state on this topic in particular. And so We invited one of the folks from the Family and Social Services Administration, Amanda DeRoss, who has been working on this issue to share with us sort of the status and help us understand what the road looks like from here forward. So Amanda.
Hi, yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I do want to be cognizant of time, so I am going to try to run through some of these slides I have pretty quickly. And then I think somebody else will give a status of where we're at when I'm done. But I am going to just kind of walk you guys through a little bit about administrative rulemaking in general, so you know kind of how the process works on my end. A 30-second introduction to me is that I've been with FSSA since 2018. And I previously was an attorney advising OCASL. So I actually worked closely with Courtney Penn and her team on all childcare legal matters. And we did rulemaking together as well. And she loved every second of it. You guys can ask her after this. It's a very exciting topic. So about 2 years ago, my role was created to specifically focus on rulemaking. So I kind of shifted into that then because it has become it's a convoluted process. It's kind of confusing. So I know, especially coming out of your guys's charge to kind of look at all of the childcare regulations and come up with the recommendations, you're probably curious as to how kind of where things go from here. So that's what I'm going to kind of walk through today, just a high level, kind of what rules are. I have like some background slides and then just kind of walk through all of the steps that I have to take from here, essentially. So to start, what is an administrative rule?
This is a very well-versed team at this point around sort of the point of the rules, given the amount of time we've spent on them. So I think you can probably sort of shoot to the process and the way forward from here if you're trying to save on time.
Sure. So I guess, yeah. If you want, Courtney, you can skip ahead through some of these because some of these are just background. Go to slide 8, I guess, which is the rule promulgation process overview, because that's kind of like where it goes from here, basically. So once we have a rule drafted, these are all of kind of the steps that we have to take from that point on. So the first one would be internal agency approval. And if you go to the next slide, Courtney, I kind of walk through these a little bit more in depth. So internal agency approval would be once OCASL has kind of drafted that rule, right? They've taken the ELAC recommendations and whoever has done the work to draft the rule, then there are additional steps that need to be taken before the agency can kind of approve it. So Office of General Counsel reviews it, and that includes specific OCASL attorneys, and then also myself reviewing it just from kind of like a rulemaking lens. And then it goes to the CFO and he has to review all the physical aspects of it because there are often, financial components to these rules. They are going to have a physical impact on businesses or providers. So he has to review it and make sure that all of our ducks are in a row there, that we've calculated out costs correctly. And then the secretary has to kind of go through and adopt it at that point or approve it at that point before it goes to the next step, which this is the one that kind of takes the longest historically. So this is the OMB and SBA approval step. OMB and SBA are charged with kind of looking at the rule in a very detailed lens and they ask a lot of questions. They push back a lot to just try to make it as good of a rule as it can be and make sure it meets all of the statutory standards of what a rule is. So that step is it can take a long time depending on how the kind of how in-depth the rule promulgation or the rule amendment is. So that step I always say that's the one that takes the longest. So the next step after this is family impact. This is a quick step. We just have to make sure that any of FSSA's rules have to go through a Gov's office approval step to make sure it's not going to have a negative impact on families or the formation of families. From there, we go to the kind of public comment period. If you go to the next slide, I think, yeah. So then there's a public comment period that rules have to go through. So I publish a notice of public comment and give the public 30 days to review all of the rule documents, which include both the rule and something called a regulatory analysis, which kind of walks through all of those financial steps. So we look through every single piece of what the regulation, what is changing, right? What requirements are changing. So we kind of walk through in this published document, here's where childcare rules exist as of today, and here's where we want to take them. And so we kind of have to highlight what all the differences are, what all the costs will be of changing those differences, and why we want to change it. And so that is publicly posted so that everybody can review it and have time to comment on. The next slide shows the notice of public hearing. So that's just something else that's posted. We do have to have, actually, if you go to the next slide, public hearings do have to be, they have to have a remote attendance option. They have to be webcast. They have to be archived on the FSSA webpage. There are a lot of pieces that we have to comply with this. But at the end of that 30-day public comment period, we hold a public hearing. So that is a chance for anybody to come and attend, and they can provide oral or written comments in person or virtually, so that we give the public plenty of opportunities to have input into these rules before we move forward. The next slide. So after that, then we review and we respond to all of the public comments. So we do have to read every single one. We have to summarize it, and we have to draft a response to it. If we are going to make changes to the rule language as a result of those public comments, we can do so, but they do have to be a logical outgrowth of the comments. So they have to be directly in response to that. And we have to kind of create a summary of, this was the public comment, this is exactly what section of the rule we're changing, and here's why. So that's one other step that kind of can take a while depending on how many public comments we receive. From there, we go to a potential second public comment period. So essentially, if we do receive public comments, we're going to have a second public comment period, which this is new. As of 2023, we do have the new second public comment period. So it kind of slows the rule promulgation process down further, but it does allow the public just another 30-day opportunity to comment, and then it culminates in another public hearing. And then from there, we go to agency final adoption. So then I have to do a bunch of stuff on my end to show that we complied with every step of the rule promulgation process. And then the secretary officially adopts the rule. From there, it goes to the Attorney General's office. If you go to the next slide, it goes to the Attorney General's office, and the Attorney General has 45 days to review and approve. Typically, they do take pretty much up to that full 45 days. So that's something else that's kind of built into the timeline of kind of where it goes from here. It is probably going to take 45 days. From there, the next slide, it goes to the governor's office. They have 15 days. They can extend it. I've never seen that happen, but they do have the ability to do so. And then from there, it is filed with the publisher. Next slide. Yep. And so they have a few days to accept it for filing. And then typically I'm flying through these, guys. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to make sure we're on time. The rule becomes effective typically 30 days after filing with the publisher. And so if you go to what is pretty much the last slide, I just have kind of like a wrap up of overall compliance. Oh, there should be one more, I think, before that. And a timeline. So because I know timeline is, or maybe I added it after I sent you these slides, Courtney. Timeline is something that everybody is always very curious about. They want to know, once we have a rule, how long does it take to become effective? And that's probably a question that you all have. It is so difficult for me to answer. There are so many behind the scenes things that I have to do and have to comply with. And then if there are multiple comment periods, that kind of delays things. When things are published, they're only published on Wednesdays, and it's typically like 2 weeks out after I get it. So it's hard for me to know when they're going to be published, how many comment periods we're going to have, how long the AG's office is going to take to review. So it's kind of impossible to say. Typically, once OMB does kind of approve the rule and it starts that official promulgation process, I typically say 6 to 8 months from that time period. But the OMB step, like I said, is the one that takes the longest. And again, you can ask Courtney Penn about this in our previous experience with it. It can take literal years. So with this one being kind of a high priority, I know it's not going to take that long, but just want to give you guys a sense of, it's hard to say a timeline from here. But once we have it ready to go and it's a polished, good, approved product, probably 6 to 8 months from there. So that, like I said, I ran through that, but I know somebody else is giving kind of an update, I think, on where we're actually at with our recommendations.
Great. Courtney, you want to give that update or one of your team?
Sure. Thank you for that walkthrough. And yes, I lovingly recall those days and times. I keep jokingly saying I actually have another master's degree in rule promulgation at this point. But I will just say very quickly that the Office of Early Childhood and Out of School Learning has been working very closely with Amanda and Jessica Keys and the rest of the legal team to really be thoughtful around how we can get this done effectively and as quickly as possible. I think when we shared at our last meeting, we were looking to work with a third-party national vendor to do some of this work. After having some engagement with that vendor, we determined that they probably weren't the best avenue to get this completed in the timeliest manner. So we're working again together with the legal team within FSSA to get our work with our procurement folks to find somebody on our, what we call the QPAs, the quantity purchase agreements, folks that have already been in place, getting somebody who is tried and true, done this work with other divisions and other departments within the state to work with Amanda and my team to get this down the road quicker than we had originally thought that vendor would be able to support. And then also on top of that, just also thinking about, much like the compensation study subcommittee, having a subcommittee through the ELAC work that helps as we're going along the way to be that review, to be that thought partner at the table as well, to be able to help us sync up as much as possible, because there are so many. There's ELAC, there's the statutory advisory councils that CASL is responsible to have. One of our vendors has an advisory committee. How do we sync all that up and have more of a one band, one sound approach that lives through ELAC that helps keep the pulse on the work and keeps us on track and keeps refresh of all the updates that are happening. So I humbly would ask that someone on the committee who's really excited about this work and passionate about it, lead that. Lisa Johnson, I don't know if you're still on here or not, but I kind of threw your name in the ring. So you can throw rotten tomatoes at me later, or anybody who thinks that that's their jam that would love to help lead that path. I think that's just a really good next step as we continue to work towards the completion and work towards getting the regulatory reform refresh done. I do want to shout out our legal team and our licensing team who's just taking those very robust regulatory reform recommendations that came out of the policy equity group that we reviewed and voted on here within ELAC, and has really taken that leaps and bounds to what could be policy changes, what can be statutory changes through legislation, and then what actually needs to live and happen through rule promulgation processes. And so we've made some really great strides there already that I'm really proud of.
Questions for Courtney?
And the rule promulgation process itself is outside of the legislative process. So it's like,
That's right.
it's like the administrative guidelines.
That's right.
That come in to tell you how you're going to enforce the legislation. Is that accurate?
Well, legislation is, air quote, the quicker win because you're changing law and being able to add rule promulgation. You're overhauling a set of rules, has to go through a much lengthier process, which is what Amanda was sharing.
I'm happy, like, I love me a good rule. As a gentleman with a short sleeve dress shirt collection, you can tell that I enjoy things like rule promulgation. So I'm happy to be part of whatever process. can be
Thank you, Sam.
Yeah.
That'd be great, great.
Fantastic. Other questions? Thank you. I appreciate the update and especially the urgency that that you're adding to the process. I know it's not easy to get this done on top of everything else that you have going on, and also that it's really essential. So I appreciate the commentary from you two, Amanda, that this is in fact a priority for the administration, and we hope that will continue to be true. And if you know, there comes a time when it's helpful for others to understand what a priority it is, we're happy to lend a voice to that. So just let me know when we reach that point. All right, we have 1 minute. No, just kidding. I'm certain we can all stay an extra handful of minutes here to the extent that we have public comment. We've talked about a lot of different things today. We have some folks with us in the room here in
Some people.
Portland. Yeah, someone left immediately when I said it was time for public comment. If anyone here in the room would like to offer public comment, we welcome your participation right now. Please feel free to come on up. All right, hearing none. Give it 1 more minute. All right, well, are there last items of new business from the committee? I just want to make sure before we adjourn, if anyone else has questions from the committee, I neglected to ask that.
I do have one question.
Sure.
I know back in December, this group voted for revamping of the QRS system, past equality. I think 2025 is going to be the pilot year for that. And I wondered if there's any information about that to share with the group.
The update around timing for past equality modernization? I know it came up in the presentation around compensation too.
Yeah, I think at this point, it's my understanding that some of the things we actually are doing now, which is the assessment pilot, the ice sprout assessment pilot was part of some of that QRIS refresh work to look at. And could that be something we want to embed in and make that part of the refresh? I will say that given this election year and the turn of the administration, I think the thought is to focus on getting this baseline in first. How can we get the regulatory system set where it needs to be, that then we then build upon that for the refresh? So I think that timeline is shifting for multiple reasons, but it's not taken off the shelf. It's just kind of phased in approach that makes the most sense, which is we truly think that the baseline is health and safety. How do we get that streamlined and then build upon that for the refresh? But great question.
Yeah, I do hope it's something that, early in the new year, we can just revisit and understand how we might, add capacity to do both things at once, because I think each are incredibly important, given the challenges that we face. So thanks for that question. Other questions from the group? Thanks for that answer. All right, well, we already have fake news here on the slide because we're going to meet one more time in late September, just very quickly, as we've talked about here, to receive that final report. But otherwise, we will still be meeting on November 12th.
For our actual business meeting to look at our annual recommendations.
And our intention would be that we would take some portion of the compensation study recommendations and embed those into our ELAC recommendations for this year as well. Is that what you're thinking about?
Yeah.
How that would go?
Yeah, so we want to set it up for a continuous loop of feedback. So moving forward, all of our subcommittees that we have working on specific topics will report out like we did today and have their recommendations. And then ELAC as a collective will combine recommendations plus some potentially for as a big group recommendations for the year.
I think that gives us a chance to maybe pull out some priorities among, so that these are all recommendations and things we think are good, and then here's sort of where we want the focus.
It gives us a chance, to identify priorities and then also to have deeper discussions about these recommendations rather than just a sit and get yes or no situation.
Great. All right, well, we will see you all soon, many of you virtually, and then we'll see you somewhere on November 12th, but Courtney hasn't told us where yet.
We don't know yet, yeah.
Okay, are you still taking offers?
Yes.
People are willing to host.
And I'm not hosting it at my house, but I will tease up myself, Courtney, and some other folks from my executive team will be out in not the virtual streets, the real streets, in October and November. This is hot off the press.
Yeah.
Having listening sessions in 4 different pockets of the state, in partnership with Indiana AUIC chapters. They're hosting the locations. It's not just a members only event, it's open to the public. There'll be more information to come. I will say the November 12th one is in Northwest Indiana, actually in Valparaiso. So it'd be great if we could
Mark,
have
sounds
both
like
meetings.
it's on
If we
you.
could have
Yeah.
both meetings there, that'd be pretty awesome.
Wait, where is it in Valpo?
I just got literally hot off the
I was
press.
gonna say, yeah, that's perfect.
It is at, Valpo University,
Okay.
at the university.
Okay.
You're Indianapolis.
I've got 15,000 square feet that I'm happy to meet in for free if necessary.
That would accommodate a lot of public comment, Mark, so
So
that might be
Yeah.
helpful.
tentatively in Northwest Indiana, we will get details together with that.
Sounds good.
That sounds great. Thank you. Any other updates? Sorry, I should have.
No, I think that's it.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Sorry.